All right, I guess this is chapter 2. And the basic principle of this chapter is specifying the theories that I think are the most relevant or that I've thought about in the past in terms of getting me to think about the reciprocity project. So at the beginning, I thought it would be actually quite easy to do something like this. And, and I will tell you in the third chapter about the reciprocity project. So it is easy in setting things up in a technical sense, but there's a lot more to it. And I think that's maybe where this is actually going to go. So the first theory that I was thinking about was decision making. So the idea with decision-making theory. Okay, so what am I talking about with decision theory? I think the easiest thing to think about is rational choice at the beginning. I think that sort of grounds what we're thinking about. And let's say I have, and this is going to sound like completely irrelevant to the whole process of creating something from nothing. And I think it doesn't necessarily fit very well. I'm not a big fan of it, but it explains the world in many different ways, but I'm not necessarily a big fan. So here's the story. We have some sort of utility function. We're trying to maximize the amount of pleasure that we actually have. And the way that we maximize that pleasure that we have, what we do is we look at the world, and we have some sort of preferences that we can rank order these preferences and choose things from highest to lowest. And we might pursue a particular set of alternatives that we sort of that we believe is the best, or we try to pick the alternatives based on these preferences by rank ordering these alternatives to satisfy the preferences that we have. And then we choose the alternative that maximizes the preferences that we expect. And so by doing that, we're going to have the highest possible utility over the actions that we choose. Now, it seems really abstract, right? So in my view, there's a lot of things that are missing from it, and it's well known that it's missing from this particular perspective. So the first thing is bounded rationality, right? So this was talked about a fair bit, and it continues to be discussed within our literature. And what bounded rationality means is that we don't have all available information. We can't predict the future. We can't understand all of the information around us because at a given time, at a given moment, the world is just too complicated. And we also can't predict the future very well because we can't sort of pre-specify all of the different actions that we can choose and everybody else can actually choose. And so we can do a moderate prediction in the very near term, where we try to maximize our, it's actually a term that we would use, not maximize, we would satisfy. So what does that mean? Because we don't know the best possible course of action, what we do is we default to the course of action or the alternative that moderately satisfies. So we go to the point of saying, hey, this is good enough. And when we believe it's good enough, then that's the alternative that we actually choose. So, what does this mean? And if you think about what I'm trying to do is an entrepreneurial venture, creating something from nothing. And with this venture, the reciprocity project, I don't necessarily know what I want. I don't know what this actually looks like. I think most people that create things, they have somewhat of a idea in their mind of what it possibly can be, but they don't necessarily have everything pre-specified. Now, the other thing is many of us don't have a clear sense of where we're going to go, and we don't predict that future very well. And the other thing we have to think about is if you're working within a marketplace, and you're trying to think about a market, which is what you're trying to create often. So I view often when you create a new entity, something, you have to create a marketplace. And that marketplace is where you're connecting individuals, the sort of buyers and sellers, and you have an exchange between those buyers and sellers. Now, in this particular situation, I don't even really know who are the buyers and sellers with the Reciprocity project. They're not clear in my mind in terms of what that is and who that is. The other thing is I think other people on the other side don't really know what they actually want. So I might be a provider of sorts, creating a platform, at a multisided platform, which we'll get into in a bit. But there might be other people on the other side that are kind of wandering through life as well, and they can't figure out what they're supposed to be doing as well. So we have a bit of a conundrum or a mess involved, and it's a very, very messy sort of system where people are bumbling around where they don't really quite know what they actually want. And they don't really understand what other people want, and we're trying to put this all together. Now, the other thing that you have to think about is that this sort of rational choice theory, and this is where I'm actually going to start getting to the behavioral theory of the firm, this rational choice theory is a theory about individuals and individual decision making. So the actor involved in this particular situation might be myself, and it might be another person that I might be talking to. But that doesn't quite make sense if you're trying to build a platform, right? So you might think about your own utility in this particular circumstance, or you might be thinking about my utility. Why am I actually doing this? And frankly, I don't know. At a given moment, I don't necessarily feel I get a great deal of utility by doing it, but I have a hunch. I guess I have guiding principles where I think that there might be some utility that exists from doing this. So, what does the behavioral theory of the firm say? The behavioral theory of the firm was originally specified or thought about by Richard Syret and Jim March. And the idea is that organizations are, and I'm actually going to bring in Nelson and Winter, which is I think 1982, 1984. I can't remember which year it is, but they talked about how organizations are. So Nelson and Winter talked about organizations as a set of routines. And this set of routines is sort of interacting relationships and interacting actions, sequences of actions that occur. Now, what the behavioral theory of the firm specifies is that we have actors, coalitions within organizations that get together and they try to negotiate the goals of the organization. And often they don't get the goals right, but they try to create a system where, and this is where Henry Grev's work has come in and sort of greatly aided this, as Philip Bromley also aids this, and the idea that we have aspirations. So they decide on what the sort of set of loose goals that the organization has, through a sort of contested contest within the organization, within these coalitions of actors. and then they come up with some sort of aspirations for the organization itself. So the idea here is that you set some aspiration for them. It's sort of a forward-facing and backward-looking, as Gavetti and Leventhal talked about, process, right? So the idea is you arrive upon some set of aspirations that you want for the organization, and then what the organization does is pursues actions to achieve that aspiration. So it's some sort of expectation for performance in the future. Often within this literature, it's talking about return on assets. Maybe it's return on, return on employees. That's sometimes used, but not that often. But the idea is that you set these aspirations where you want to be in the future. Say you want, a return of 5% in the next year. Then if you achieve that 5%, then you don't do anything. But if you don't achieve it, that means that you failed as an organization. And this failure, and the reason why we actually classify, or individuals, managers, organizations classify actions or outcomes into success and failure, is because it's hard to sort of process all of this information in the world. And we don't necessarily use a continuous sort of function just to specify how you perform in the world. You use this sort of dichotomous function, right? So you'd classify things into a 0, 1, or you succeeded or failed. So if you fail, then what you do is you perform what is called probabilistic search. So this is all based on the behavioral theory of the firm. And within this, what you'll do is you'll search for why you actually failed. What were the causes? What problems led to a failure? And what you're going to do is, if you don't solve it immediately and you continue to fail, you're going to take a deeper dive and try to come up with a cause and discover what that particular cause is that is underlying, or the problem that is underlying why you're actually failing. And what's going to happen is you're going to go through successive rounds of this probabilistic search until you come up with a cause, and then you're going to solve that cause or solve that particular problem. And then if you're succeeding, what you often do is have excess resources. You're going to use those excess resources to search for more possibilities. This is sort of what's called slack search. Now, what we do know are sort of recent developments within this area. Pino Adia and Henrik Greve have some work in this area that suggests that if you don't make the performance aspirations, what you do is sometimes you might do something like you might use I'm blanking on the name of it, but the idea is to use self-enhancing behaviors, right? Some sort of, maybe it's politics, or you think, hey, that failure wasn't caused by me, it was caused by somebody else. Or, there's reasons why that existed that's beyond my control, and sometimes it sort of mutes the learning from that failure and that circumstance. With success, we may not necessarily have that as much, but maybe you actually you assign that success to yourself rather than to the organization. So you could see here with this basic model, even though it might work and even though it makes sense, it tends to be more larger organizations, and it tends to be ones that have already existed, and it tends to be ones that everybody sort of knows what the aspirations are, what the performance should be, and there might be multiple actors at play, right? So the discussion is often about multiple individuals forming a coalition within the organization. What this doesn't talk about, and what it doesn't sort of get to, is this idea that we have to make things up often, and we don't know what are the objectives to many of the things that we actually do. We often don't know what our aspirations are. We can kind of guess what those things are, but they're often not really defined for many of us that are sort of creating things for the first time. There is some literature on sort of what is called the sciences of the artificial, and looking at how, and this is Herbert Simon was talking about this, looking at how people create things for the first time, the sort of creation of new ideas, but it hasn't developed as much within the literature. Now, this sort of goes to entrepreneurship literature, and the entrepreneurship literature is really interested in how often individuals come together and create something, or maybe it's a single individual. Often sort of makes this presumption that a single individual has some cognitive differences, they sort of see the world differently, and then they can sort of either discover or create opportunities that other people can't see. Now, the challenge with this is that if you don't really know what these opportunities are, and if you don't understand what the marketplace is, that puts it almost makes entrepreneurs into sort of superhumans, right? It makes them be very greater than human, right? So they're better than everybody else. They could sort of see the world. And I don't necessarily view the world that way. And I would say that much of the entrepreneurship literature probably, even though that they may see some effects, they may see sort of negative effects that happen as well with having these characteristics. I would be more prone to suggest that we're all very similar as human beings. And we might have some subtle differences, but often those subtle differences don't make a large difference. I would presume that we are sort of coming up with, or we're thinking about the world in a very sort of structural, functionist way, right? Where you're thinking about things and how things actually work at this moment, and you're sort of putting pieces of the puzzle together, and you're imagining things as sort of a lot of structure and how the world actually works. I would actually specify another way, where you have to just be flexible and okay with the resources that you're given on hand. So with the Reciprocity Project, there is some literature. So I wanted to create a sort of multisided platform, right? And it's difficult. The problem is with the multisided platform, and there's discussion about platforms that were started with two-sided platforms. And so what are these platforms? These are intermediaries, usually software intermediaries that connect buyers and sellers together in one particular spot. And then that literature evolved to multi-sided players, where they talked about software providers and developers that would participate on these larger platforms. Now, if you could see that the platform itself, the idea behind it, doesn't fit with the behavioral theory of the firm very well. It doesn't necessarily talk about, the behavioral theory of the firm doesn't talk about this kind of organization that is very amorphous. And there's also a new phenomenon that's happening as well, where we have creators that are coming in play. And creators use these particular platforms, these multi-sided platforms, to garner an audience. And this didn't exist until relatively shortly, in the last little bit, to have this capability, to have somewhat of a large following based on the things that you say and you do. And I think that this is an interesting and an important development within organizations. As you can see, that there's many different literatures, many different sort of theories to explain a particular phenomenon, and none of them actually fit very well. And none of them are sort of well positioned to explain how one might actually create a platform such as the Reciprocity Project in the world. And I'm going to talk about that in the next chapter, and how is the Reciprocity Project, what is actually happening with it, and why it evolved in the certain way that it did. And the reason is because it is meandering in many different ways. And it's because that I am trying to figure out what this all means and how to put it together when I don't necessarily understand what is the right course of action. So that's where rational choice theory doesn't necessarily make sense, because I don't really know what the outcomes are going to be with this. Now, with building the platforms in sort of platform literature, there's not a lot of studies. There's a few studies on talking about the chicken and egg problem that exists, right? So it's one thing to actually have a platform and study it, a larger platform, because they're very interesting. But it's another thing to think about, how do you actually build this and put it together and have a group of individuals that actually believes that it exists. Now, the difference between an organization and sort of a startup organization is a simple belief. I think that is an important thing, that individuals actually believe that this thing exists and it matters in this world, and they're willing to provide their time and effort, money and resources within this particular organization. They're willing to give those resources because they think that there's actually going to be some value added that they get from it. It's creating value from them. So, for example, Facebook creates value for individuals. That's why they're willing to spend so much time on Facebook. Now, it makes sense when you have the larger organization created and the larger platform created, but it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense when you have nothing, when it is sort of invisible, when it's made up, when it's one person that sort of stood up and said, I'm going to create this particular thing. So if you could see all of these things, none of them really hold. So to some degree, the Reciprocity Project at this moment, for me, as the person that's building it and creating it, it is more likely the individual that's actually creating this thing, right? And it's more maybe about rational choice. But then, on the other side, my hope and my belief is that this will actually turn into something much larger, where there'll be many individuals that will be participating and working on this platform. And as well as it will be a sort of larger platform for other people to get information and help from. So sort of like if you imagine Khan Academy, it was Sal Khan, when he created it, didn't necessarily know what it was supposed to be when he created it and started putting YouTube videos up. So all of this doesn't necessarily hold with the Reciprocity Project. They make sense and they sort of explain parts of it, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of explaining how to do things and put it together, and the sort of meandering nature that happens with the creation of something from nothing. And that's what I'm going to talk about in chapter 4. So there is one last literature I almost forgot to talk about that is important and relevant here, and that is the literature about technological innovation. Now, this literature is very much focused on creating problems or discovering problems and solving these particular problems using technology and coming up with technological solutions. So the goal is you have some sort of problem that exists, and then you come up with a solution, and that solution solves that problem, and that solution should hopefully have technological value such that, or it creates more value than it extracts from the marketplace. So the idea is to have a tremendous amount of value created and to have very little market or very little value that's extracted or appropriated by the creator of a particular platform or a particular organization. Now, much of the technological innovation literature is very much focused on the creation of basic technologies itself or larger organizations that have put these things together. Very little, and so much of the sort of infrastructure that's in place to understand technological innovation and how we sort of rank order technologies, how we pick them, how we might have financing for technology, is very much on the infrastructure of larger organizations or sort of Silicon Valley startups. And the reason is because we have access to rich information and rich data from Silicon Valley startups, as well as so venture capital data. We have a lot of that on, and we also have a lot of data from larger corporations that are willing to participate and share. So for those individuals, which I think is actually the majority of entrepreneurship and the majority of innovators, we don't have a lot of information on the individuals that sort of make things up from the bottom up. So those are the home innovators, the users that just, or free innovation. I believe that's what Eric von Hippel talks about. And he's been interested in this in the last little while. People just create things. And we don't necessarily have a good plan or a model and how it's actually how it works, and we don't necessarily have a good model with it incorporating recent technological developments like so for example social media and sort of the broader the broader technologies that we have access to, such as contracting freelance platforms like Upwork or Freelancer. And I think that's an important part of the puzzle with the Reciprocity Project, which I'll talk about in the next chapter. Now, all of this seemed to make sense for me, that I should be able to use all of these different theories and they should be helpful in order to create the particular platform that I was interested in creating. The problem is none of them really worked very well. They all were completely ineffective and inefficient in helping me decide what to do next. And I often had to do things, and I often have to do things that are not necessarily conventional or easy to explain. And I often have to do things that are about just everyday, very simple actions that I didn't think were going to be as relevant. And almost none of the literature, none of the theories that exist are about these everyday plain actions of just getting up and doing something every day to create the particular platform. So many of the theories that we have are very large and broad and sort of very general, but they don't necessarily give any explanatory behavior or explanatory behavior for my sort of day-to-day actions and what actually happens. And I think this is a broad complaint with much of the theory that actually gets developed is that it doesn't apply to me. It's not realistic enough. It's not generalizable to my situation. And so it only explains a very, very small fraction of what happens in the day-to-day. And so I think that that is an important part that is neglected with this sort of meandering, wandering idea of entrepreneurship that I'm going to propose in this book.